Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. Have you ever wondered what the Lutheran Reformation looked like in a specific locality? In his new book, Becoming Lutheran, Dr. John Maxfield reveals this by detailing the intellectual, personal, social, and political influences and events that shaped the Lower-Saxon town of Brunswick on its journey from Evangelical Reform to Lutheran culture in the 16th century. Dr. Maxfield is professor of history and religious studies at Concordia University of Edmonton and is our guest on this episode. Before we start our conversation with Dr. Maxfield, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the podcast. How can your congregation turn significant financial gifts into a long-term funding source that blesses your church for generations? The LCMS Foundation was created to provide professional investment services to LCMS churches, schools, and RSOs. They've helped hundreds of congregations create, manage, and grow endowments using investments tailored to each congregation's unique goals and needs. And now they'd like to help yours. Learn more at lcmsfoundation.org/podcast. I'd also like to thank our friends at Concordia University, Wisconsin for their support of the podcast. No matter where you are in life, Concordia's online continuing education classes will fit your schedule and connect you with a supportive community. CUW offers flexible opportunities to deepen your Bible knowledge, explore church history, and enhance your ministry skills. Enhance your personal and spiritual growth by visiting cuw.edu/continuinged to view the full course list and get started today. Now on to our conversation with Dr. John Maxfield. Dr. Maxfield, it's good to see you today.
It's good to see you.
Now, you just shared that you were moving into a new office and things are changing there in your office. How are things on campus as the school year gets started?
Well, I'm in a new building and there's a lot of commotion around the building. Hopefully we won't have any interruptions of noise, but yeah, things are fine. It's a new term. I'm also chair of the Department of Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Classics starting this term. So I've got the full plate and very glad to have finished up this big long-term project and moving on to new things as the weeks and the new semester begins.
So speaking of this big long-term project, we're talking about your new book, Becoming Lutheran. And if I remember correctly, this is, when you say a long project, this is about 15 years in the making. Is that right? From your studies or when it's kind of started?
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, and for the longer story, it in some ways was reviving as I began my teaching career here at Concordia in 2009, so 15 years ago. I was getting into the literature of the Reformation and teaching it to my students. And it resurrected questions I had already as a doctoral student. And I turned, as students always do in their doctoral work, shifted my dissertation project into something more focused. At the time, it was on Luther's theology and his Genesis lectures. But actually, that was the second attempt of a doctoral proposal that originally I was interested in looking at pamphlet literature in the 16th century in Germany in the Reformation and the popular appeal of the Reform and why Luther's movement succeeded where it did and continued as a popular movement. Anyway, I resurrected some very old ideas from 25 years ago, really, as I developed my first sabbatical proposal while teaching here at Concordia, which took shape in between 2014 and 2016. And I began the formal research of this project, which culminated in this book, Becoming Lutheran, in September of 2016, so exactly 8 years ago.
Well, you can tell by, as you read the book and as you even just flip through, you can tell there's a lot of meticulous research involved. And so for scholars, even casual armchair historians, there's a lot to really dig into in this book that I think those readers will really enjoy. So thank you for committing so much time to this. Uh, Tell us a little bit about like what led you to zero in on, I should say, the idea of the book, and correct me where I am too general. You focus in on one community, the community of Brunswick in Germany, and kind of explore how that community reacted and interacted with the Reformation as things were happening in the 16th century, correct?
Yes. So basically, what I wanted to do was to trace the way the Lutheran Reformation developed in a particular community from very early in the Reformation movement to its full development by the mid 16th century and eventually its legal recognition in the Holy Roman Empire, first of all, um, by the later 16th century, in a time when the Lutherans were very disorganized and at loggerheads with each other over many of the controversies of mid-century. Um, the Reformation continued to develop, in this particular town of Brunswick, now called Braunschweig, was an example of a community in North Germany that had followed Luther's ideas very early and matured in a very natural way, I think we can say, into one of the most Lutheran territories, or as I like to call it, cultures of the later 16th century and beyond. So, the full title of my book, Becoming Lutheran: The Community of Brunswick from Evangelical Reform to Lutheran Culture, is aimed at again, focusing on one community with the way this particular concrete group of people approached or received Luther's ideas, the way they shaped them in their own conversations, and the way they formally enacted Luther's reform ideas already in the late 1520s, and the way that through opposition from various parties within and without the town, they continue to shape their church life into what we could call a Lutheran culture, or uh, in one way, my book is part of a reimagining of the Reformation, to looking at the Reformation movement as not simply the reform of the church, but really the Christianizing of European culture, so that the a more authentic or genuine Christianity was experienced not just by the clergy and the hierarchy, as many Catholic reformers, as well as evangelical reformers like Luther, uh, understood the church of their time, but the way everyday people and local congregations experienced the changes of Christianity in their day.
Well, I thought it was interesting how, and I'm losing the quote as I quickly try to find it, but you talk about how it was, um, it went from no longer being, you know, the universal Catholic Church to all of a sudden it was still a Christian society, but now we have these different confessions or denominations that split out through the process of this. I would imagine there were any number of communities that you could have chosen to focus on for this book. What was it about Brunswick that jumped out at you to be the epicenter of the story?
Well, partly accidental, as I do mention in my brief introduction to the book itself. I was sharing some ideas about the kinds of questions I was interested in pursuing with colleagues, and especially my doctoral advisor, Scott Hendricks, from 20 years before, when I studied at Princeton Theological Seminary. And he was the one who actually said, well, "Why don't you have a look at Braunschweig?" But the bigger answer to that question is what made this particular community particularly appropriate for the kinds of questions I was asking. And the answer to that is first, the movement, the what historians sometimes call the German evangelical movement that became the Reformation, was already beginning amongst mostly lay people in this particular community, already before Luther published his 95 Theses in the fall of 1517. And in other words, the ideas that became the Reformation focused on Luther's experience were already being discussed. And I trace in the early chapters of the book the way Luther's earliest writings achieved a hearing in this community, and they began to call themselves Martinists, or followers of Martin, at the very time that he was being um, criticized so broadly in the broader church, and then condemned by both Pope and Emperor in 1521. And the way that this support for Luther's ideas very early in 1520 gained a following in the town. Again, first with some lay people, merchants, most of them. One priest in particular, Martin, excuse me, one priest who was no longer in the town, but was in correspondence with people in the town, Thomas Munzer, an early follower of Luther, who became one of the most radical of the reformers and leader of the Peasants' War of 1524 and 25. They were talking with each other about Luther's ideas, about problems such as indulgences, and as this group of Martinists or evangelicals began to coalesce in the town, some preachers began to preach this Lutheran or evangelical message from the pulpits of the parish churches. And at the expense, often, of their jobs, they were frequently criticized by the organized clergy, organizing what was called the clerical union. They would be routinely removed from their positions and expelled from the town by the town council in the mid 1520s. And they always had the possibility of intervention by the territorial lord, or the duke of the territory of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel, as it was called. Um, the still very much Catholic and opponent of the developing Reformation, Duke Heinrich the Younger of Wolfenbüttel. And so Brunswick became very appropriate for the questions I was asking, because of the way the movement developed in the face of opposition rather than support of either the territorial ruler. And in contrast, for example, Luther receiving the support, cautious support to be sure, first of Elector Frederick the Wise, later the much more strong support of Duke Frederick's brother, Johann, who became known as Johann the Steadfast, or Johann the Constant, who continues to lead Saxony in the late 1520s and into 1532 and following. And again, in Brunswick, what's particularly interesting was the way support for Luther's reform coalesced, the way people essentially demanded that the town council endorse a reform, and the way they appealed to Wittenberg for assistance in this. In the long run, in late 1527, early 1528, they're appealing to Wittenberg for help. And Wittenberg finally sends Johannes Bugenhagen, the pastor of the Wittenberg Church and Luther's very close associate in this team of reformers in Wittenberg, Saxony, comes to Brunswick and formally introduces the Reformation, but as a process of negotiation with both town council and the leaders of the commons, as I call it, or as historians refers to the commune, in this essentially independently or self-governing local community, was bringing about reform in the late 1520s. And in 1528, they were the first town then to endorse a full-scale order or church constitution, the first of many. There were some other formal reformations already occurring around the same time, but in Wittenberg and Saxony in 1527, the previous year, and in the Lutheran town of Nuremberg a few years earlier, they had instituted some changes, formal changes in their church structures. But Johannes Bugenhagen's church order for the town of Brunswick was the first fully developed church system, I guess we can call it. That was negotiated, finally adopted by the town council unanimously. They emphasize, and Bugenhagen emphasizes in his introductory preface and early remarks, in what is published in late 1528 as the church order or the Christian order of the town of Brunswick. In Wittenberg, again, authored by Bugenhagen, and really lays out, it's about 270 pages in the original Low German dialect in its printed form. And that becomes the basis for this church system and what I call maturing evangelical or Lutheran culture in the community of Brunswick.
So it sounds like Brunswick was very much a trailblazer for other communities throughout Germany as they were starting to look at Reformation and embracing Lutheran theology at that time.
Yeah, I suppose you could say a trailblazer. I mean, Wittenberg is very much at the helm of leading these various movements everywhere
Hmm.
in the north, and countering some other movements, mostly in the south of Germany and in Switzerland, where other ideas of reform that Luther labels sacramentarian and despising of the sacraments, as that comes to be known. Uh, I don't know if I would say that Brunswick becomes itself the model community. There's still most towns and territories are looking to Luther and his Wittenberg team for guidance. But because the system is so extensive in the Brunswick church order, and because it is published early on and is made available, first in this Low German dialect, then not long afterwards, I think it's 1531, they publish High German, or the language Luther wrote and spoke in Wittenberg, a High German translation. And that becomes a model, we might say, and maybe that's what you're getting at in terms of being a trailblazer. Um, this is all in the time before a Lutheran confessional tradition is really in its developed form. Even with Luther's small catechism and large catechism of 1529, these are tools that various areas of the Reform are using. But the Augsburg Confession comes later, and its status as the main statement of Lutheran belief is actually really 20 years down the road. Not until the 1550s does the Augsburg Confession really begin to take on that more formal role of trailblazing, as it were, for what.
I think model was definitely the word I was looking for. So
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
that's a better word.
Yeah. What we're talking about here is kind of the formation of a pattern of doctrine or church life that in its origins is called a body of doctrine, a corpus doctrinae. And the in Brunswick, in fact, it is this church order itself that is the formal statement of how church life, according to the gospel, will proceed from that thenceforth. And it's only much later that other documents like Luther's catechisms, the Augsburg Confession, but interestingly, it's interpreting the Augsburg Confession is very much in dispute in Lutheranism in the 1550s, 1560s, and therefore there's always other documents, the apology to the Augsburg Confession, Luther's Schmalkald articles. All of these are being used and eventually become the bodies of doctrine for the various areas that accepted a Lutheran Reformation. And Brunswick is very much in the early stages of that slow development of what it
Sure.
means to be Lutheran.
Talk to us more about the connections to the later developments concerning the Smalcald War, the Prince's Revolt, Magdeburg Confession, and how that affected things in the community.
Yeah, well, as my book develops, out of after 1528, September 1528 is when the community endorses this extensive church order authored by Bugenhagen. From that point onward, it's not simply easygoing. There's opposition to this new church system, opposition from the local Catholic clergy, who are being forbidden from at the time by this new church system from saying mass in the traditional way in their churches, and the all of the parish churches of the community are making the changes that Luther had promoted and our Bugenhagen had articulated quite fully in the Brunswick Church Order. But again, there's opposition locally. There's opposition from the Catholic Duke, again Heinrich the Younger, he's one of the leaders, along with Luther's primary political opponent in Germany was the cousin of Duke Friedrich the Wise and his brother Elector Johann, that is Duke George of Saxony. These are the main leaders politically of opposition to the Reformation in the 1530s. And Duke Heinrich plays a critical role among these. They're constantly threatening war against the Lutheran princes and the reformers and the cities like Brunswick that have adopted the Reformation. And so Brunswick is continuing to implement what is articulated in the church order in the 1530s in the midst of considerable opposition, and is doing so very successfully. The various monastic institutions are rather quickly closed or abandoned by the friars or the monks or the nuns. Some of them hold on a little longer. Interestingly, those institutions in the town that were under the patronage of the Catholic Duke were the ones that held out the longest because uh, they were still essentially independent of the governance of the town. And so it was more difficult, for example, though they attempted for the town council to shut down the saying of the mass, for example, in the local fraternal churches, as they were called. And the you asked about the later political developments. They all culminate after a decade of threatening war. War does erupt in Brunswick itself in 1542, not from the emperor's side, but when the Lutherans of the Schmalkald League, who have organized themselves in a defensive league against the Catholic authorities of the empire, and they invade the territory around Brunswick in the midst of long-term conflict between the Catholic Duke Heinrich and the princes supporting the Lutheran Schmalkald League, one of which was a very good friend previously of Duke Heinrich, that is the Landgrave of Hesse, Philip of Hesse, one of the two captains of the Schmalkald League, as they were called. But to get to your question, what are the connections to the later developments politically as well as ecclesiastically? Is that Brunswick, from very early on, is one of the cities supporting this Schmalkald League, which is dominated by the princes, but its financial support is mostly from the cities. Very important cities of the south, in particular Strasbourg and others that provide the bankrolling necessary for raising of armies that the princes were dependent on. And Brunswick and various other territorial and some free cities of the north were members of the Schmalkald League very early on. 1531 is when Brunswick joins the league. And so they're active in this political and jockeying back and forth first trying to prevent war by a defensive, strong league, but then engaging in what they considered to be a preventative war by attacking the territory of Duke Heinrich, because to be honest, he's blatantly abusing those areas of his territory, some of which had adopted the Reformation. He was reputed to have burned to the ground the city of Einbeck over its support of the Reformation. He was threatening Brunswick again and again. Again, it had developed in the late Middle Ages a quasi-independence, de facto independence of the rule of the Catholic prince, but he was constantly threatening to impose his will on the free commune of Brunswick and on the legally free city to the south of Brunswick, which name is escaping me presently, but one of the other towns, legally a free city of the empire within Heinrich's territory, Heinrich was threatening with conquering or imposing his will upon. And it's in the context of these kinds of conflicts that the Duke of Saxony and the Landgrave Philip of Hesse do attack Duke Heinrich and actually succeed in forcing him out of his own territory. And in 1542, they actually begin a Lutheran Reformation of the territory around Brunswick. Historians have called this a Reformation from the outside, as the League is essentially ruling the territory around Brunswick. And that contributes to the back and forth of jockeying of powers that finally culminates in the Imperial War against the Schmalkald League. In late 1545, it's beginning in 1546 is when the war actually begins in the south. But in 1547, the emperor is victorious against the Duke of Saxony, Johann Friedrich at the time, and the Landgrave. And that could have meant the crushing of the Reformation, the imposing of what the emperor called the interim law that would decide what will happen to all these Lutheran areas until a council could meet to determine the future Catholic culture of their day. And Brunswick, among several other northern cities, are the ones that successfully resist the victorious emperor in the aftermath of this Schmalkald War and the political victories of the mid-1540s. And you mentioned in your question, some of the other dynamics of that. The resistance of the city of Magdeburg is upheld, are noted by many as the real center. But it was only one of several cities, including Brunswick, that were maintaining a posture of resistance to the imperial policies and the imposition, essentially, of Catholicism after the successful war of the emperor against Lutheranism. And in the long run, this eventually leads to the revolt of several princes against the emperor, the imposing of the compromise of a peace known as the Peace of Passau in 1552. But that's just, again, these are all just steps on the way to the formal enactment of a peace, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, that for the first time recognizes as legal the Lutheran Reformation and thus the Lutheran church structures that had been developing for 30 years in the empire. And that would go on to become the Lutheran churches. Territorial churches, city churches like in Brunswick, and eventually state churches in so much of Europe.
There's definitely no lack of drama throughout the history of the Lutheran Church, particularly in Germany in the 16th century. So this is a very neat exploration of that history, and there's a lot going on. I mean, there's definitely a lot of intrigue and a lot of back and forth among the different factions. So it's really neat to see. As we look down the road historically, what what was the role that Brunswick played for the eventual unification around the Formula of Concord?
So you're talking about the later developments that healed these
We're
divisions
jumping ahead a little bit.
within Lutheranism that occurred in the midst of all of this conflict. And uh, I'll just focus first of all on our former or earlier conversation about Brunswick providing a model, not only a model of a fully developed Lutheran church system and developing culture as from the church order of 1528 and following, successfully implemented over time, again, in the midst of significant opposition, politically and ecclesiastically, throughout this period. Um, um, and Brunswick is one of those towns, like we've focused on, Magdeburg, the most famous of them, but Bremen, another one. The only victory of the Lutheran princes in the Schmalkald War was in the outskirts of Bremen as a result of Bremen's successful ongoing resistance to the emperor, victorious everywhere else. What I think you're getting at with this question is the the long-term impact in a time of significant upheaval in Germany and really throughout Europe that brings about the various Protestant confessions or denominations, and as a result contributes to the very differently developing nation states or politically divided or no, ecclesiastically divided emperor, which from the mid 16th century forward is part Catholic, part Lutheran Christendom, and later will include some Calvinist areas as well. And in the midst of this time of significant upheaval and transition, Brunswick is playing a key role. And you speak about the unification, about the Formula of Concord. Again, what is that? In the 1570s, the Lutherans are finally successful in dealing with all of their internal, intra-Lutheran, doctrinal, and we can say political strife, to bringing about the Concordia that gives its name not only to many of our institutions like our seminaries and my own university here, but also to our Book of Confessions, the Concordia or Book of Concord. And Brunswick plays a particular role, not because of its location or its political status. Again, Brunswick is an independent, free commune, and its church life is really determined by the community, not by the later Lutheran dukes of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Heinrich's son, after he dies in 1568, becomes a Lutheran and converts the whole territory to Lutheranism in 1569 and following. All of this is a time where Lutheranism is slowly finding its way through significant internal as well as external upheaval. And Brunswick plays a critical role in that eventual concord, really only because its superintendent in the town is Martin Chemnitz. He's the pastor of the largest church in the town, St. Martin, but more importantly, he is the superintendent of the Brunswick churches, leader of its ministerium of pastors. Later becomes the superintendent of the territory, the Lutheranized territory of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel. And he is the one playing the key role in the developments that lead to the Formula of Concord, and does that from his position as a superintendent of the churches of the Community of Brunswick. So, and ironically, though Martin Chemnitz is one of I think we can say the key leader in the success of the Formula of Concord to bring harmony, as Concordia means, to the very divided Lutherans of the 1550s and 1560s. Finally, bringing Concordia. Um, uh, Martin Chemnitz has a more personal conflict with his Lutheran duke at the time, Duke Julius, over various things Duke Julius has done. And Duke Julius actually prevents his territory from endorsing the Formula of Concord that Martin Chemnitz was one of the chief authors of. And again, he doesn't have real power in the town or community of Brunswick, and so that's rather immaterial. But again, Brunswick wasn't looking for this kind of healing that Lutheranism, by and large, throughout Germany was looking for, because it had achieved its unity and its concord much earlier in this process of the developing of a Lutheran culture in their community.
Well, as we start to wrap up, history matters, and it's important for us today to understand what came before us. What lessons can we as Lutherans today take away from the experiences of the community of Brunswick as they moved through these different phases in the 16th century?
Well, yeah, okay, that's a very interesting question, and I guess I would take two tracks in answering that question. First of all, the lessons historians and interpreters of the Lutheran Reformation take, both theologically and historically. And one big lesson that I hope my fellow pastors and theologians of the Lutheran Church, specifically in the still very confessional Lutheran identity of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Lutheran Church Canada, and others, is that the Reformation, despite I think the way of explaining the Reformation in our circles is that the Lutheran Reformation was a conservative Reformation that developed a much more orderly and a system that was much more faithful not only to the scriptures but to the theological traditions of Catholicism inherited from the early church. I, as a historian, simply do not accept that explanation of the Lutheran Reformation. Luther's Reformation was a radical movement theologically. It was radical. It was tempered politically and socially for various reasons, but I would say that this key word of upheaval that we were talking about characterizes the Lutheran Reformation just as much as the other reform movements of the 16th century. And the Lutheran Reformation achieved really the redefining of what it meant to be Christian in communities like Brunswick and everywhere the Lutheran Reformation was developed. And at the heart of that understanding of what it meant to be Christian for Luther and therefore for the Brunswick community was the idea of freedom. Luther's idea of the gospel was that the message of Christ frees people from the enslavement of their sin, from the enslavement of the world and its institutional oppression, forms of oppression, from the slavery to the attacks of the devil, if not the spiritual and physical assaults of the devil. All of this, Luther believed, is achieved through the gospel, which announces and brings about freedom. And Luther interpreted that freedom as an individual freedom in the sense that he was not looking for freedom from the structures of society, such as feudalism or the economic orders of the day. He was less interested in the political freedoms that some others were pursuing through the Reformation as well as through their other traditions of freedom. But Luther's message of freedom resonated equally well in a community like Brunswick that had achieved significant political freedoms, again, in the generations before the Reformation, through the developments of the later Middle Ages that made it a self-governing commune, even though, again, technically it still had a territorial lord. So that's the response I give, first of all, for historians and educated, pastors, church leaders reading this book, that take to heart the real the way Luther's Reformation took root in one particular community to lead to a very significant reshaping of their Christian experience as a community. For the armchair historian or the layperson, the Lutheran Christian that might, I hope, pick up this book, what does it mean to become Lutheran in the 16th century? I hope that people will recognize and resonate with the way Luther's message of freedom could have a tremendous freeing effect on an individual struggling through life in this world as a Christian, whether from burdens of conscience or from the burdens that are placed upon us in our world. And I think that my book gives a real close look at the way various people felt impacted by Luther's message of the gospel. And it changed their world. It changed their individual life. It changed their church life. It changed the culture of their community. And as a result, Christianity and life in Brunswick and many other communities of Germany would never be the same.
Well, I would agree with you on that. And I would say, as a layperson, armchair historian, just curious person overall, the book really does give a perspective on the Reformation that I haven't seen in other places. So it is kind of a neat way to look at the Reformation and see it in a new light that maybe we haven't looked at before in our usual study of Reformation and Martin Luther. So if you're at all curious about the Reformation, about 16th century theology and history, pick it up. Listeners, I encourage you to. I think you'll learn a lot. There's a whole lot there. And Dr. Maxfield, thank you for taking time today to chat with us about Becoming Lutheran, the Community of Brunswick, from Evangelical Reform to Lutheran Culture.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation to talk with you today. I really enjoyed it, and I hope the message of this book gets a hearing and will have its impact in our Christian culture today.
So for our listeners, we'll have a link to the book in the show notes. I encourage you to take a look at it and check it out. And again, Dr. Maxfield, we appreciate you being with us today. Listeners, we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.